Today we cover the innocent, the 12th and final archetype in the series. We end in the find fulfillment quadrant, where motivation turns inward instead of outward. The archetypes here aren't trying to help the patron conquer the world around them. They're helping the patron improve their relationship with themselves. The sage pursues understanding because knowledge creates confidence. The explorer pursues freedom because discovery creates growth. The innocent pursues something that often gets dismissed as simplistic, even though it's one of the hardest things to deliver well: peace and balance. That peace doesn't come from ignorance. It comes from removing unnecessary friction from life. The innocent doesn't ask the patron to become someone new or accomplish something extraordinary. It offers relief from complexity. It creates moments where life feels manageable again, where trust feels possible again, and where optimism doesn't feel foolish. That word again sits at the center of the archetype. The innocent isn't inventing a better future as much as it's restoring something people feel they've lost. That makes this archetype unusually relevant today. Nearly every category competes by adding something: more features, more options, more personalization, more notifications, more urgency, more reasons to pay attention. Brands have become so focused on proving value that they've forgotten one of the simplest ways to create it: reduce the burden on the patron themselves. The innocent wins by subtracting instead of adding. It removes confusion, tension, and emotional weight. In a marketplace obsessed with novelty, simplicity becomes a competitive advantage. That simplicity is also why the innocent is so often misunderstood. People hear the name and assume the archetype is naive, childish, or disconnected from reality. They picture someone who hasn't experienced disappointment yet. That's almost the opposite of what this archetype represents. The innocent isn't optimistic because it's avoided hardship. It's optimistic because it's decided hardship doesn't deserve the final word. There's an important distinction between innocence and naivety. A child trusts the world because they haven't yet learned otherwise. The innocent chooses trust after seeing enough of the world to know how valuable it is. One is the absence of experience. The other is a deliberate response to experience. Brands built on this archetype simplify life because they've recognized that complexity isn't always progress, and cynicism isn't the same thing as wisdom. So how can we understand the innocent even better? Well, let's dig in. Behavioral psychology supports this view far more than many people realize. One of the strongest bodies of research comes from Barbara Fredrickson's work on positive emotions. In 2001, she introduced the broaden and build theory, demonstrating that emotions such as joy, gratitude, serenity, and hope do more than improve mood. They expand attention, increase cognitive flexibility, strengthen relationships, and help people build durable psychological resources over time. Positive emotion isn't simply something people enjoy experiencing. It changes how they perceive the world and how effectively they navigate it. That research deserves a small clarification because it's frequently misunderstood. Fredrickson later proposed a specific positivity ratio, suggesting people flourish when positive emotions outnumber negative ones by roughly 3-1. That claim attracted significant criticism, and in 2013, the mathematical model behind the ratio was successfully challenged by Nick Brown, Alan Sokal, and Harris Friedman. Fredrickson later withdrew the precise ratio while maintaining the broader findings of her original research. The mathematics didn't survive scrutiny. The underlying psychology did. Positive emotions still broaden attention and help people build resilience. They simply don't operate according to a universal equation. And this distinction, I think, is really important because the innocent isn't selling happiness as entertainment. It's more so creating psychological conditions that help patrons think feel and behave differently. When people feel emotionally safe, they become more open, more creative, more trusting, and more willing to engage with others. Those outcomes aren't sentimental, they're measurable. They also explain why brands rooted in optimism often earn loyalty that extends well beyond product performance. The Innocent exists because people don't spend their lives searching for excitement alone. They also search for places, products, and experiences that let them relax. Every person carries some level of cognitive and emotional load through their day. Work creates pressure. Relationships create uncertainty. Technology demands constant attention. News cycles reward outrage. Even entertainment competes for increasingly fragmented attention. Against that backdrop, brands that consistently lower emotional temperature become remarkably valuable. The motivation behind the Innocent reflect that need. Happiness is the desire for experiences that feel uncomplicated and emotionally uplifting. Safety is the desire for environments where people can lower their guard instead of keeping it raised. Optimism is the desire to believe tomorrow can be better than today without pretending today's problems don't exist. Nostalgia is the desire to reconnect with memories that remind people who they are and what matters to them. Moral clarity is the desire for honesty, decency, straightforwardness in a world that often rewards manipulation and ambiguity. Notice what these motivations have in common. None of them ask the patron to become someone else. They reduce friction so the patron can become more fully themselves. That is what separates the Innocent from every other archetype. While others create value by adding capability, confidence, status, knowledge, or transformation, the Innocent creates value by making life feel lighter. That sounds simple until you try to build a brand around it. Simplicity requires discipline. Removing friction is almost always harder than adding features. Yet, when it's done well, patrons remember it because they remember how the experience made them feel long after they've forgotten what the brand actually said. So, let's dig into what makes this archetype so strong. The Innocent succeeds by lowering emotional resistance. Every strength associated with this archetype reduces effort, uncertainty, or tension for the patron. That reduction is not accidental. It's the product of disciplined decisions made across the entire brand experience. Every interaction should leave the patron feeling slightly better than they did before they engaged with that brand. The first strength is optimism. Optimism is often confused with positivity, but they're not the same thing. Positivity is an emotional tone. Optimism is a belief about the future. An optimistic brand acknowledges that problems exist while reassuring the patron they can be overcome. The difference matters because people don't trust brands that pretend everything is perfect. They trust brands that make difficult situations feel more manageable. And this becomes particularly valuable during periods of uncertainty. When competitors amplify fear to capture attention, the Innocent becomes a stabilizing force. It doesn't manufacture urgency or exploit anxiety to increase conversions. It provides confidence instead. That confidence creates an emotional consistency patrons begin to rely on. Over time, the brand becomes associated with reassurance rather than reaction. The second strength is joy. Joy isn't found in grand gestures nearly as often as people think. It lives in hundreds of small decisions that make an experience more pleasant than expected. A thoughtful confirmation email, packaging that makes someone smile, clear instructions instead of confusing jargon, a waiting room that feels welcoming instead of clinical. None of these moments creates the loyalty by itself, but together they shape how the patron remembers the experience. This works especially well in categories people they expect frustration. Healthcare, banking, insurance, government services, utilities, and countless B2B industries often accept friction as unavoidable. An Innocent brand questions that assumption. Instead of accepting stress as part of the category, it asks where unnecessary stress can be removed. The resulting experience feels distinctive precisely because nobody else considered making it enjoyable. The third strength is kindness. Kindness isn't softness, and it certainly isn't weakness. It's the consistent decision to treat people with respect, even when doing so costs the organization something in the short term. That principle influences everything, from return policies to customer support to the language used during difficult conversations. Patrons notice these behaviors because genuine kindness has become increasingly rare in commercial and even personal interactions. Kindness also creates resilience. Every brand makes mistakes. Products fail. Deliveries arrive late. Systems break. Patrons are often willing to forgive those failures when they believe the company has consistently acted in good faith. Goodwill functions like trust in a relationship. It accumulates over time and creates margin for inevitable imperfections. Brands that spend years earning that trust often discover its value during the moments they need it most. The fourth strength is transparency. The Innocent reduces cognitive load by making interactions easy to understand. Pricing is straightforward. Policies, they're written in English. Processes don't require decoding. This simplicity benefits the patron because every unnecessary decision consumes attention and mental energy. Behavioral scientists often describe this as cognitive load. The more effort required to understand an experience, the less enjoyable that experience becomes. Transparency also changes how people interpret bad news. When a brand has consistently communicated honestly, patrons are far more likely to interpret disappointing information as integrity rather than deception. They may not like the outcome, but they believe the company is telling them the truth. That distinction is difficult to earn and surprisingly easy to lose. The final strength is resilience. This is perhaps the least obvious advantage of the Innocent archetype, because these brands are built on enduring human values rather than cultural trends. They rarely need to reinvent themselves to remain relevant. Their purpose isn't tied to the latest platform, movement, or aesthetic. It rests on the timeless desire for honesty, hope, kindness, and simplicity. That stability influences the patron's expectations. People don't expect Innocent brands to be perfect. They expect them to be sincere. When mistakes happen, patrons evaluate whether the brand responded consistently with its values. If it did, trust can often be rebuilt surprisingly quickly. Authenticity has a remarkable ability to survive imperfection. But as with all archetypes, there are strengths, but there are also weaknesses or the shadow side. And the Innocent is no different. The Innocent's shadows emerge when optimism stops being disciplined and becomes avoidance. The same characteristics that create emotional safety can easily undermine strategic effectiveness if they aren't balanced with clear thinking. So the first weakness I want to cover is naivety. This isn't the strategic optimism discussed earlier. It's the belief that good intentions alone produce good outcomes. Brands operating from this mindset underestimate competitors, ignore changing market conditions, and assume sincerity will compensate for poor execution. It rarely does. Patrons appreciate kindness, but they also expect competence. When optimism replaces strategic rigor, the brand begins to feel well-meaning but totally incapable. The second weakness is vulnerability. Brands that operate with openness and generosity inevitably expose themselves to exploitation. Competitors copy their ideas. They abuse flexible policies. Vendors take advantage of accommodating relationships. None of this should surprise anyone. Every strength creates a corresponding vulnerability if left unprotected. The greatest risk often appears internally, when leadership refuses to acknowledge conflict because it threatens the brand's optimistic identity. Someone still has to absorb that conflict. It usually becomes the responsibility of frontline employees. They deal with difficult customers, unrealistic expectations, and operational failures, while leadership continues projecting calm optimism. The organization appears peaceful from the outside because the pressure has simply been transferred to the people least equipped to carry it. The third weakness is conflict avoidance. The innocent naturally seeks harmony, but harmony achieved by ignoring problems is temporary. Difficult conversations delayed today become larger problems tomorrow. Brands begin simplifying issues that require nuance or avoiding public conversations they should be leading. Patrons eventually recognize the difference between a reassuring voice and an evasive one. One builds trust, the other slowly erodes it. The fourth weakness is disillusionment. Brands built around goodness often struggle when confronted with situations that challenge their own worldview. A public controversy, ethical failure, or organizational crisis can produce an identity crisis alongside the operational one. Leaders become defensive because the event contradicts how they see themselves. The resulting communication often feels inconsistent because the brand is trying to protect its self-image instead of addressing reality. This challenge extends internally as well. Employees who join because they believed in the organization's values can become deeply discouraged when those values appear compromised. Brands that promise hope need systems capable of sustaining hope during difficult moments. Otherwise, morale can deteriorate much faster than leadership expects. The last weakness I want to cover is by no means the only set of weaknesses, and it's dependency. The innocent wants to be liked, and that desire can become dangerous when approval begins driving decision-making. Brands start changing their voice to satisfy critics, softening difficult positions to preserve harmony, or avoiding necessary decisions because someone might object. Over time, the organization loses clarity about what it actually believes. No enduring brand has universal approval. Every meaningful position attracts supporters and detractors alike. The innocent has to remember that authenticity creates belonging while appeasement creates confusion. Patrons don't build trust because a brand agrees with everyone. They build trust because the brand consistently behaves according to the principles they recognize as genuine. So let's jump into some brands that have adopted the innocent as a driver for their purpose and essentially their entire brand. And the first one I want to cover is Coca-Cola. Few brands demonstrate the innocent archetype more clearly than Coca-Cola. On January 18, 1971, Bill Baker, creative director at McCann Erickson, found himself stranded in Shannon, Ireland, after fog diverted his flight. The airport was filled with frustrated travelers, forced to spend the night together. By morning, something had changed. The same people who had argued the night before were laughing together over bottles of Coca-Cola in the airport cafe. Baker scribbled a note that would eventually become one of the advertising's most iconic campaigns. I'd like to buy the world of Coke. The campaign almost failed before anyone saw it. The radio version received little enthusiasm. Bottlers argued the message was too soft to sell soda. The first television shoot was abandoned because of bad weather. The second production in Rome pushed the budget to nearly $250,000, an extraordinary amount, a lot of money for that time, for a commercial at least. Within days of airing, Coca-Cola received thousands of letters requesting the song, eventually donating the first $80,000 in royalties to UNICEF. The campaign succeeded because it wasn't selling refreshment. It was selling emotional restoration. Coca-Cola promised a brief moment where differences disappeared. Conversations became easier, and the world just felt a little simpler than it had a few moments before. That creates an uncomfortable observation. Coca-Cola sells sugar water. The product has spent decades at the center of public health debates, yet the archetype continues to resonate. That doesn't excuse the product, but it does reveal something important about branding. Patrons don't judge archetypes' virtue alone. They judge whether the emotional promise is consistently delivered. Coca-Cola has spent generations reinforcing the same promise of optimism, togetherness, and uncomplicated happiness. People know exactly what emotional experience they're buying into. Now, if only Coke could apply the idea of the innocent and all of its tenets to how it makes its product. Because if you make a product simpler, it may lose shelf stability, but it'll certainly be a lot healthier. The second brand I'd love to cover is Disney. Disney applies the innocent archetype at a scale few organizations could ever replicate. Now, a lot of times people like to say Disney's the magician, and I think I can see that at times, but there's also something wonderful about the Disney brand that makes it feel more like an innocent brand. Its films promise hope, moral clarity, and happy endings. Its parks promise a temporary escape from ordinary life. Every part of the experience is designed to make the outside world feel slightly farther away. Families don't visit Disney because they believe the parks are perfect. They visit because Disney consistently protects a feeling they struggle to find elsewhere. That feeling doesn't happen accidentally. It requires extraordinary operational discipline. Cast members receive extensive training on guest interaction, including using 2 fingers or an open hand when giving directions because pointing can be considered rude in some cultures. Trash cans are placed throughout the parks at a remarkably consistent interval to reduce litter and preserve the environment guests expect. Thousands of decisions that seem insignificant on their own combine to create a single emotional outcome. And that's the lesson so many brands and brand strategists miss. Simplicity rarely comes from doing less work. It usually comes from doing far more work behind the scenes. The easier an experience feels for the patron, the more discipline was required to remove everything that would have complicated it. The third example of a brand adopting and living an innocent archetype driver is Charmin. Charmin proves the innocent archetype isn't limited to inspirational brands or emotional categories. It works just as well selling toilet paper. Beginning in 1964, Procter & Gamble introduced Mr. Whipple, a fictional grocer whose running joke was pleading with customers, "Please don't squeeze the Charmin," before squeezing it himself. The campaign lasted more than 20 years, making Mr. Whipple one of the most recognizable advertising characters in America. When the campaign eventually ended, Charmin didn't abandon the strategy. It simply changed characters. The animated bears that replaced Mr. Whipple continue solving the same psychological problem. They remove embarrassment from a category people generally prefer not to discuss. Instead of treating bathroom tissue as a functional commodity, Charmin treats it as a source of comfort, humor, and everyday happiness. That is the innocent at work. The archetype doesn't need profound emotional transformation. Sometimes its job is simply to make ordinary life feel a little lighter. So this completes all 12 archetypes as well as the quadrants. Each one represents a different pattern of human motivation, but none of them exist to help brands develop a personality. They exist to help brands understand the psychological role they play in people's lives. That's why selecting an archetype has never been about choosing the one you like most. It has always been about identifying the one your patron genuinely needs and your organization can consistently deliver. Every archetype has to pass 3 tests. It must solve a real psychological need. It must reflect how the organization actually behaves, especially when no one is watching. And it must occupy a territory the market hasn't already claimed. Miss any one of those, and the archetype becomes performance instead of strategy, or at the very least, something very difficult to grapple ahead based on that. Bill Backer didn't discover Coca-Cola's archetype in a conference room. He discovered it by paying attention to people. He watched frustration become connection over something as simple as sharing a bottle of Coke. Human behavior revealed the opportunity long before the strategy gave it a name. That same opportunity exists for every brand. Watch your patrons carefully enough, and they'll tell you what they're really searching for. Your job isn't to invent that need. Your job is to understand it. Then build, shape, craft a brand capable of serving it consistently across every facet of the organization, from personality to the people to operations, the product, everything. Because that's really what it's all about. The strongest brands are believable because every single part of that company has been shaped and formed around a brand strategy. And at the core of brand strategy is a psychological driver. Archetypes give you a fast track for finding it. So it's by no means over. We're going to continue down this path, unpacking more nuances and details about brand strategy and how you can start to leverage those tools to make better, stronger brands that last a long time and charge ahead of the herd. Until next time, please do like, subscribe, share, and comment. I would love to hear the dialogue on what you think about archetypes specifically, but also this series. Until next time.